The execution chamber at Stateville Correctional Center had never held a man quite like Salvatore Bianchi, and the officers who'd escorted hundreds of condemned men down that corridor felt it the instant his cell door slid open. He was 36, tall and unhurried, his black hair combed straight back with those early strands of silver at the temples that made him look less like an inmate and more like a man walking in to sign off on a deal. The faint scar tracing his left jaw caught the glow of the ceiling lights as he turned his head. For 5 years, this was the man the papers had crowned the king of the South Docks, the one who'd steered the unions, the warehouses, and the fate of half the city with nothing louder than a quiet nod. They'd braced for him to show up with lawyers shouting, with threats, with the swagger of a man who'd always bought his way loose from every trap that ever closed around him. Instead, Salvatore Bianchi moved in his chains, with the calm of someone who'd already laid down everything he'd ever held, and that calm rattled the officers more than fury ever could have. For 3 weeks, he hadn't requested a single thing. No appeals. No calls to the powerful men who still owed him. A man who could once buy a whole courtroom now sat waiting, as though he had an appointment no one else could see. And the woman assigned to walk him to the end was the one person in that building with every reason on earth to wish him gone. Ruth Delgado was 28, slight, her dark hair pinned back tight, her hazel eyes carrying a sorrow she'd long since stopped hiding. 3 years earlier, she'd lost the 2 people she loved most in a shooting the whole city had laid at the feet of Bianchi's organization, and she'd taken the chaplain's post not to find peace but to stare evil straight in the eye. She'd sworn to herself she'd feel nothing walking him to that room. Then he paused at the chapel doorway, turned to the very woman he knew despised him, and softly repeated the 7 words that had already granted him this final stop. "I want to see the Blessed Mother." Even though the request had been approved hours earlier, the warden went stiff seeing him actually there. Officer Wade, 20 years on the job, let the folder slip from his hands as the reality of it hit them. Because condemned men ask for a last meal, a last smoke, a last phone call, but no one, not once in anybody's memory, had ever requested to stop for a miracle, and what turned Ruth's blood to ice wasn't the request. It was his eyes as he said it, not frightened, not begging, but steady and sure, as if he already understood something that she and these walls and the whole world outside had never been let in on. They led him into the dim little chapel, convinced a man like him only wanted to stage one final act of repentance, and Ruth followed with scorn sitting hard in her chest, and something beneath it she wouldn't let herself name. She'd no idea the next 5 minutes would tear apart everything she believed about justice, about hatred, and about the man she'd cursed for 3 long years. Because what happened behind that door dropped the hardest officers in the building to their knees, sent the warden running for help, and left the most bitter woman in that room weeping for reasons she'd spend the rest of her life trying to understand. If this story moves your heart, drop a like so more people can find it. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that no one's ever beyond redemption, and subscribe to walk every step of these stories with us. Now let's go back to the 3 weeks before that morning, to the day a grieving chaplain was handed the file of the man she believed had shattered her entire world. 3 weeks before that fateful morning, the late autumn sunlight was still falling in a pale gold wash through the small window of the chaplain's office, and Ruth Delgado sat there alone with a thick file on the desk before her, like a living thing she did not dare touch. The cover was ash gray, its corners worn, and in the very center was the bold printed name she had heard that made her sick over the past 3 years. The name that had once filled front pages, the name that had echoed through nights when she could not close her eyes. Salvatore Bianchi. She looked at it for a long time, and her hand, the hand that had held dozens of trembling hands of men about to leave this world while praying with them, now trembled faintly like the hand of a stranger. She had faced murderers, drug traffickers, men the courts called beyond saving, and she had never faltered. But this name was different. This name carried the smell of gunpowder from an October evening, carried the laughter of 2 people she would never hear again. She drew in a deep breath, opened the file, and the first line struck her eyes with the coldness of a sentence already passed. Charges, sentencing date, execution schedule, 3 weeks. They wanted her to serve as his chaplain for the final 3 weeks of his life, wanted her to sit beside the man the whole city believed had stolen her husband and daughter from her, wanted her to pray for the soul of that very man. Ruth closed the file, leaned back in her chair, and shut her eyes to hold back the tears threatening to spill. It was then that the office door opened softly, and Sister Agnes stepped in with the slow gait of a woman who was 67 years old, but still carried steadiness in every step. She set 2 cups of hot tea on the desk, pulled out the chair across from Ruth, and looked at her with eyes that had witnessed too much sorrow to need any words. "You mean to refuse," she said, not as a question but as an obvious truth. Ruth opened her eyes, and her voice caught when she spoke. "I can't do it, sister. I can't sit beside that man and pretend my heart isn't screaming for him to pay. I came to this calling to serve God, not to forgive the man who destroyed me." Sister Agnes was silent for a while, her wrinkled hands wrapped around the teacup as if searching for a little warmth. Then she spoke in the low voice Ruth had learned to trust over the past 3 years. "Do you know why I chose you for this work, Ruth? Not because you are the strongest, because you are the only one here carrying a wound that has not healed, and sometimes God places us before the very thing that hurts us most, not to punish us, but to heal us." Ruth shook her head, and one tear finally rolled down her cheek. "Some wounds never heal, sister." The old woman smiled, a sad and knowing smile. "You cannot heal what you do not dare look at directly, my child. You may turn your back on this file, and I will not blame you for a word of it. But ask yourself whether 3 years from now, you will still be the woman carrying this stone inside her chest, or whether you will dare step forward and set it down." Those words hung in the small room like a prophecy neither woman yet fully understood. Ruth lowered her head and looked at the file, and in that moment, something inside her, no matter how small and hesitant, gave a quiet nod. Just then, a young correctional officer named Powell knocked and stepped inside, holding several papers that needed signatures from the chaplain's office. He placed the papers on the desk, glanced at the name on the file cover, then frowned slightly as if some odd memory had just come back to him. "Oh, this Bianchi case," he murmured, half to Ruth and half to himself. "Strange thing, really. There are so many chaplains on death row, and yet he specifically requested." He did not get to finish the sentence before the radio at his hip crackled loudly, a voice calling him back to Unit B at once, and Powell hurriedly gathered the papers, nodded farewell, and quickly stepped out, leaving the unfinished sentence suspended in the air. Ruth looked up, a faint crease appearing between her brows. Specifically requested what? She meant to call after him and ask him to explain, but the correctional officer had already disappeared around the bend in the corridor, and the sound of his footsteps dissolved into the familiar noise of the prison. Sister Agnes seemed not to notice the remark, only patting Ruth's hand gently before standing to leave. But to Ruth, that half-finished sentence was like a tiny grain of sand caught in the gears, a crooked detail she could not yet explain. She looked down at the file again, and this time, beneath the familiar anger and pain, something new began to kindle. A faint curiosity she tried to push away but could not put out. Why would a man about to die, a man who could choose anyone to comfort him in his final days, want beside him the very woman who hated him more than anyone else in the world? That night, when Ruth returned to her empty apartment, she placed the file on the dining table, right beside the small framed photograph she never kept far from her. And she sat there for a very long time in the dark, between an unanswered question and a decision she knew she had already quietly made. That small framed photograph was the one thing Ruth always kept with her, and in the dim light of the apartment, the faces inside it seemed to come alive and pull her back to an evening 3 years ago. The last evening when her world had still been whole. Back then, their little house on Chestnut Street was always fragrant with food and filled with voices, and Miguel, her husband, was standing by the stove, stirring a pot of tomato sauce from his grandmother's recipe way, while singing an old love song under his breath, a song whose words he never remembered correctly. He sang, "My heart belongs only to you," as, "My heart belongs only to beer," and little Sophia, their 4-year-old daughter, laughed so hard she had to clutch her stomach, her black curls dancing with each bright burst of laughter, clear as silver bells. "Daddy sang it wrong. Daddy sang it wrong," the little girl cried, her big round eyes shining with the pure joy only children possess, and Miguel pretended to be shocked, pressing a hand to his chest and calling on heaven as he declared that he was the greatest singer on all of Chestnut Street, which only made the child collapse into another fit of giggles. Ruth had been leaning against the kitchen doorway then, cradling a cup of tea in her hands, and she remembered thinking that happiness did not need anything grand, that happiness was simply this moment, this warm kitchen, this laughter. At dinner that night, Sophia made the whole family promise that over the weekend they would go to the park by the lake, the place with the ducks she loved feeding with breadcrumbs, and Miguel solemnly placed a hand over his heart and swore that even if the sky fell, he would take his little princess there. Sophia clapped in delight, then turned to her mother and demanded that Mommy promise too, and Ruth had bent down to kiss her daughter's forehead, whispering, I promise, my darling." She had no idea that it would be the last promise she ever made to her little girl. Late that evening, they realized there was no milk left in the house for Sophia's breakfast, and Miguel suggested that the whole family walk together to the little grocery store on the corner, only a few blocks away, a trip so ordinary that no one gave it a second thought. Sophia insisted on bringing along her favorite teddy bear, while Miguel kept singing that same song, with the wrong words as they walked down the brick sidewalk, and their laughter rang through the chilly October night air. Ruth remembered holding her daughter's hand, that tiny hand warm inside her own, and she remembered the warm yellow light spilling from the grocery store window as they drew near. That was the last thing she could remember completely, that yellow light, that small hand, that song sung with the wrong words, because immediately after that, her world went dark. Ruth never allowed her memory to go beyond the threshold of that grocery store. She had learned that there were doors inside the human mind that were better left unopened, and she knew only that when she woke in the hospital many days later, with a head wound and an emptiness in her chest that nothing could fill, the two people she loved most were no longer in this world. They told her it had been a gangland execution, that those bullets had not been meant for her family, that her husband and daughter had only been innocent people standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they told her the name of the man the whole city believed had been behind it all, the name Salvatore Bianchi. When she returned to the house on Chestnut Street, Ruth stood for a long time before the door she did not dare enter, because she knew that inside was silence, a terrible and absolute silence that had replaced all the laughter that had once filled that place. The kitchen no longer smelled of tomato sauce. The dining table was still there, and on it were the 3-place settings she had laid out for breakfast the next morning. 3-place settings of which 2 would now forever have no one to use them. 2 empty chairs. She sat down in her own chair between those 2 empty chairs and stayed there through the long night, unable to cry, unable to speak, with only an immense hollow space swallowing her whole. In the months that followed, when the trial took place, Ruth attended every day, sitting silently in the row reserved for victims' families, and she remembered seeing him, the man with that terrible name, seated at the defendant's table, with a strange calm that filled her with revulsion. There was one moment, when the judge read the sentence, when he turned his head and looked straight at her, a look Ruth could only interpret then as the cold indifference of an unrepentant killer. She carved that look into her heart as if carving a curse, and for 3 years, whenever the pain rose again, she would take that look out and use it to feed her anger, to have something specific to hate. But tonight, sitting in the dark with the file beside the photograph, Ruth did not understand why that look kept returning to her mind again and again, and she also did not understand why, for the first time after all those years, she was wondering whether she had ever truly seen what was in those eyes at all. But to understand the man behind that gaze, one must turn time back even further, to the years when the name Salvatore Bianchi was still whispered with a strange mixture of fear and respect through the streets around the South Harbor. The world he ruled was a world of hidden laws, where one word from him carried more weight than any statute written on paper, and those who lived in that world all knew that Bianchi had his own principles, boundaries even he would never cross, even if that made him difficult to understand in the eyes of men who knew nothing but violence. There was a story the dock workers still told, the story of a mechanic named Heiress, a clumsy man who had borrowed money from the organization to pay for his wife's treatment and then found himself unable to repay it. By the usual rules of that world, an unpaid debt led to consequences no one wanted to think about, and one evening, Heiress was brought before Bianchi, trembling like a leaf, certain these were the final hours of his life. But when Bianchi entered the room, what he saw was not a debtor, but the small photograph that had fallen from Halloran's coat pocket when the man collapsed to his knees. a picture of 3 little children smiling with missing teeth. Bianchi picked up the photograph, looked at it for a long time in silence, then did something that stunned everyone present. He tore up the debt note. "Go home," he told Halloran in his quiet, low voice. "Go home to your children. A father should not be absent from his children's dinner because of money. Your debt is gone. But you must promise me one thing, that you will never let them grow up without you." Halloran cried like a child, and he never forgot the night the most notorious boss in the city gave him his life back because of 3 gap-toothed smiles in an old photograph. To outsiders, that act was irrational, even a sign of weakness, but to those who understood Bianchi, it was the expression of something buried deep inside him, an unshakable line drawn around children and families. And that same line led to the second story, the one people told less often because it revealed another side of him, more frightening but also more worth pondering. Among Bianchi's men was a man named Renner, cruel and hot-tempered, someone who always believed that power meant the right to trample the weak. One day, a rumor reached Bianchi that Renner had used threatening words and actions against a young woman. Working in a diner near the harbor, a girl who had nothing to do with their world, simply because she had refused his arrogant demands. People said that when Bianchi heard the news, his usually calm face darkened in a way even those closest to him had never seen. He summoned Renner, and in front of everyone, he stripped the man of every position and every privilege within the organization, banishing him from the harbor forever with a warning so cold it reached the bone. "In my world," he said, and his voice was not loud, but every word was heavy as stone, "a man who threatens a woman is not a man. You think strength is something used to bully someone weaker than yourself. No. Strength is something used to protect them. You have forgotten that, so you no longer have a place here. Get out, and pray I never hear your name tied to a woman or a child again." Renner vanished from the city that very night, and the story spread like a silent reminder of what Bianchi would and would not tolerate. That was the real Salvatore Bianchi, a man who had done many things the law would never forgive, a man whose hands certainly were not clean, but also a man with a twisted yet ironclad moral code, a boundary he would rather die than cross. And that was why, to those who truly knew him, the accusation that this very man had ordered gunfire on a crowded street, taking the lives of a father and an innocent child, was not only horrifying but so unreasonable it was impossible to believe. Because if there was one thing the entire underworld knew about the king of the harbor, it was that he would destroy with his own hands anyone who dared harm a family, not that he would ever give the order to do it. But that truth, that crucial truth, was the one thing no one in the trial was willing to hear, and it was also the one thing Ruth Delgado, the woman holding hatred inside her dark apartment, did not yet know. 3 days later, Ruth stood before the steel door of the death row visitation room, the file clutched tightly against her chest like a shield, and she drew in a deep breath before nodding for the correctional officer to open the door. She had told herself all through the night before that she would go in there, fulfill her duty as a chaplain, read a few prayers if he asked, and leave without allowing a single shard of emotion to touch her heart. She would be ice. She would not let him see even one tear, one tremor, anything that man could take from her again. The door opened, and he was sitting there behind the thick glass partition, his cuffed hands placed neatly on the metal table. He looked different from the image in her memory 3 years ago. Thinner, with more silver at his temples, but those gray eyes were the same, still carrying that deep calm that immediately made the familiar anger boil inside her chest. Ruth sat down in the chair across from him, placed the file on the table, and spoke in the coldest voice she could gather. "I am Ruth Delgado, the chaplain assigned to you for the time you have left. I am here because it is my job, and for no other reason. If you need prayers read, I will read them. If you need a priest for confession, I will arrange it. Beyond that, I have nothing to say to you." She had expected a reaction, a provocation, a mocking remark, anything that would give her a reason to feed her hatred. But Bianchi only looked at her for a long while, and in his eyes there was none of the arrogance she had prepared herself to face, only a quiet sorrow and something almost like gentleness that unsettled her. "Thank you for coming, Miss Delgado," he said, his voice low and soft, each word chosen carefully. "I know this is not easy for you. I do not expect you to speak with me. Your being here at all is already more than I deserve." Ruth clenched her hands beneath the table, trying to hold back the emotion rising inside her. She did not want kindness. Kindness from this man felt like an insult, as if he were trying to soothe his own conscience by seeming gentle in his final days. She looked down at his hands, and for the first time, she realized he was holding something, a small leather-bound book so worn that the edges of the pages were curled and faded, preserved with the care one gives a treasure. It was a Bible, so old it might have passed through many generations, and he rested his cuffed hand upon it with a reverence she could not help noticing. "This Bible belonged to my mother," he said softly, as if reading the question in her eyes. "She read it every night until the day she died. There are lines she underlined in here, notes in the margins in her handwriting. When I hold it, I feel as if she is still beside me. Perhaps it is the only clean thing I still have after everything I have done." Ruth did not answer. She would not allow herself to answer. But something in the way he cherished that book drove a small thorn into her impenetrable armor, and she hated it, hated the feeling that the monster in her imagination was becoming more complicated than she wanted him to be. She stood, gathered the file, and prepared to end this brief and suffocating meeting, when Warden Doyle, a middle-aged man, stepped forward to open the door for her. As Ruth passed him, he murmured, his voice filled with curiosity as if he could not help himself. "You know, Miss Delgado, this is rare. Death row inmates are usually assigned chaplains by schedule. Nobody gets to choose. And yet Mr. Bianchi here filed a proper request, wrote your name clearly, insisted that you be the chaplain assigned to him. We all thought it was strange." Ruth stopped at the threshold, her whole body seeming to freeze. She slowly turned her head and looked back at the man seated behind the glass, and Bianchi was still sitting there, his calm gray eyes fixed on her, not looking away. "You requested me," she asked, and for the first time her voice lost its coldness, replaced by naked bewilderment. "Why? Why me, of all the people in this world?" Bianchi was silent for a long time, and she saw his throat move slightly as if he were swallowing something heavy. "Someday you will understand, Miss Delgado," he finally said, his voice roughened. "But not now. You are not ready to hear it, and I do not yet have the right to say it." Ruth stood there for another moment, her breath catching as 1,000 questions twisting through her mind. Then she turned sharply and hurried out into the corridor, carrying with her a new mystery she knew she would not be able to set aside. That mystery followed Ruth through the days that came after, and perhaps it was precisely that mystery that made her, though she did not want to admit it, begin paying more attention to that man than she allowed herself. In her role as chaplain, Ruth had the right to move with relative freedom through death row at certain hours, visiting cells, speaking with people society had abandoned, and she had always done that work mechanically, keeping her distance from everyone. But one noon, as she was walking down the narrow corridor, carrying a tray of prayer books to an elderly, frail inmate, she accidentally witnessed something that slowed her steps. In the last cell of the row was a young man named Elias, barely past 20, a lost boy who had made a terrible mistake and was now waiting for his turn on death row. For the past several days, Elias had been ill, burning with fever and unable to swallow anything, his young face so pale that he looked even more like a child, curled up on the iron bed like someone abandoned. Ruth stopped when she saw Bianchi, who was in the neighboring cell, saying something to the correctional officer delivering the meals in that quiet, low voice of his. She could not hear everything, but she saw Bianchi push his own food tray, still untouched and warm, through the slot in the door, motioning for the officer to bring it to Elias. "The boy needs to eat more than I do," he said, and his voice carried a gentleness Ruth had never imagined a man like him could possess. "Tell him to try to eat just a little thin porridge if he can. A sick person shouldn't lie there hungry, and if possible, please ask for another blanket for him. It gets very cold here at night, and he's running a fever." The officer, accustomed to the selfish demands of inmates, looked briefly surprised before nodding and carrying the meal tray to the next cell. Ruth stood still at the corner of the corridor, hidden in the shadows, and she felt something shift uncomfortably inside her chest. She had spent 3 years drawing in her mind the image of a cold-blooded monster, a man who ordered deaths without blinking, a man with no heart. But that monster had just given up the last meal of his final days to a sick boy, and worried whether that boy would be warm enough in the cold night. She tried to push the feeling away, telling herself it was only an act, that men like him always knew how to perform in order to deceive others. But even to her own ears, that reasoning sounded hollow, because Bianchi did not know she was standing there watching, and he had no audience for whom to perform. Ruth hurried away, her heart in disorder, and she tried to forget it for the rest of the afternoon. But fate seemed to want her to see more. That evening, when she returned to death row to retrieve the notebook she had forgotten in the chaplain's office, she passed the row of cells, now sunk in darkness and silence, with only the pale yellow light falling from the high ceiling. When she neared Bianchi's cell, she stopped again, because through the bars she saw him kneeling. The man who had once made an entire city tremble, the man who had once ruled the harbor with a single nod, was now on his knees on the cold cement floor, his mother's old Bible open before him, his hands clasped together, his broad shoulders trembling faintly. He was praying, and he was crying. Ruth had never imagined that a man like him could cry, and those tears were not the tears of a man afraid to die. She could recognize that, because she had sat beside enough people about to leave this world to know the difference between fear and something far deeper. This was the weeping of pain, of remorse, of a terrible burden he carried inside him. She heard fragments of the words he whispered in the darkness, broken and choked. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness for everything I've done," he said to some invisible presence. "But I beg you, please watch over the innocent. Please don't let their pain become meaningless. And please give me enough strength to do what is right, whatever the cost may be." Ruth took one step back, her heart beating wildly, and she felt the wall of hatred she had spent 3 years building suddenly show its first crack, small, but enough for a strange ray of light to slip through. She was no longer certain. For the first time since that fateful night, the image of the monster in her mind began to waver, and in its place came a question that frightened her more than hatred ever had. If he was not the man she had always believed him to be, then what was she supposed to do with all the hatred she had lived with for so long? She hurried out of death row that night, forgetting the very notebook she had come to retrieve, carrying in her heart a confusion heavier than anger. That confusion kept Ruth from sleeping, and the next morning she arrived at the prison earlier than usual, hoping work would help her push aside the thoughts tormenting her. She went to the officer's station to pick up the visitation schedule for the week, and there she met Officer Wade, the man who would be present on the fateful morning she had not yet lived through but would soon come to know, a veteran correctional officer with 20 years tied to these walls. Wade was a large man, his hair already streaked with gray, with the face of someone who had seen too much to be easily shaken, and Ruth had always respected him for his rare calm and blunt honesty. He was pouring coffee from an old pot, and when he saw Ruth enter with dark circles beneath her eyes, he poured another cup and pushed it toward her without asking. "You look like you've had a long night," he said, his hoarse voice friendly. "Bianchi giving you trouble?" Ruth took the cup of coffee, hesitated for a moment, then decided to ask directly about the thing haunting her, because she needed to hear the judgment of someone who had watched death row inmates long enough to understand them. "Mr. Wade, you have guarded death row for so many years. You've seen every kind of person come and go through that door. I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll answer honestly. There's something unusual about Bianchi, isn't there? I can't say exactly what it is, but he isn't like the others." Wade leaned back against the desk, took a sip of coffee, and his eyes grew distant as if he were turning through an entire notebook in his mind. "You know, Miss Delgado, in 20 years in this place, I've walked more than 40 people to that final room, and I've learned how to read them, how to read the way they face the countdown. Most of them fall apart, you know. The toughest-looking men, the ones who come in here acting like nothing under heaven can scare them. Sooner or later there's a night when I hear them crying softly in the dark like lost children. Some go mad, smashing things, cursing, clawing at the wall until their hands bleed. Others slip into a kind of emptiness, like breathing corpses, eyes staring into nowhere and seeing nothing. I've seen it all, every kind of person facing death." He stopped, turning the coffee cup slowly in his hands, and his voice lowered. "But Bianchi is different. And the way he is different keeps me awake, Miss Delgado. Makes an old man like me think. He doesn't fall apart, and he isn't empty. That calm of his is not the resignation of a man who has given up. I can tell the difference. A man who has given up has dead eyes, but his eyes are still bright, still awake, still watching everything. It isn't the stubbornness of a hardened man who no longer knows fear either. It is something I have never seen in all these years. He is calm in the way a man is calm when he is waiting for a journey he has prepared for carefully. A man who knows exactly where he is going and why, as if he is holding something the rest of us don't know, some heavy secret he carries with a calm that can chill your blood. Ruth felt a shiver run down her spine, because Wade's words matched in a frightening way the very thing she had sensed but could not name. "What do you think it is?" she asked softly. "That secret?" Wade slowly shook his head. "I don't know, and truth be told, I'm a little afraid to know, but I'll tell you something. Last week, I was on the night shift, and I stopped in front of his cell the way I usually do on rounds. He was awake, sitting there in the dark. I asked if he needed anything, just asking for the sake of asking, and he looked at me, then said something I still remember. He said, 'Mr. Wade, don't trouble yourself over me. Some people carry a burden because they chose to carry it, and for people like that, peace does not come from being set free, but from keeping the promise whole.' Then he smiled at me, a gentle smile, and went back to his Bible. I walked away and kept thinking about that sentence. A burden he chose to carry, a promise he wants to keep whole. You tell me, what promise would a cold-blooded killer have that's worth keeping at the cost of his own life?" That question hung between them in the cramped officer's room, and Ruth could not answer it. She only felt the crack inside her widening more and more, and the thing she had believed she knew with certainty for 3 years now began to fracture into 100 pieces of doubt. Those fragments of doubt tormented Ruth, until they turned into a new anger, an anger no longer pure and certain as before, but tangled and painful, because she hated that she was beginning to hesitate, hated that the monster in her mind was dissolving, and some part of her longed to face Bianchi one more time, and force him to reveal his true face, so she could reclaim the hatred that had given her the strength to survive all these years. The next morning, she entered the visitation room with a ruthless resolve, and in her coat pocket, she carried something she had never shown anyone, the final photograph taken of Sophia, her little daughter, the photograph she always kept in the frame beside her bed. Bianchi sat there as he always did, his mother's Bible placed before him, and when he lifted his eyes to greet her with his usual gentle look, something inside Ruth burst apart. She pulled the photograph from her pocket and slammed it down on the metal table, right in front of the glass separating them, her hands shaking violently. "Look at her," she said, her voice breaking into pieces. "Look at my little girl. Her name was Sophia. She was only 4 years old. She loved feeding ducks at the park by the lake. She laughed when her father sang the wrong words. She had a whole life ahead of her that she should have been allowed to live. And now I have nothing left but this photograph. Do you know what it feels like to set 3 place settings on the breakfast table every morning for months, only to remember that 2 of them will never be used again? Do you know what it feels like to walk past a toy store and have to turn away because you can't breathe? They told me you were the man who took all of that from me. So I want you to look at her face. I want you to look straight at the face of the child the whole world says you stole from me." Bianchi said nothing. He did not defend himself, did not deny it, did not turn his face away as she had suspected a guilty man would do. Instead, he slowly lowered his gaze to the photograph, and she saw his gray eyes rest on that small face, rest there for a very long time. And in that moment, something in his expression changed in a way that made Ruth go still in the middle of her fury. His eyes filled with tears. Not the tears of a man cornered, but a grief so deep and honest that she could not understand it. A grief that seemed even larger than the pain she was pouring out onto him. He placed his cuffed hand against the glass, just beneath the photograph, as if wanting to touch that small face and being unable to. "She was beautiful," he said, and his voice was hoarse, broken. "I am sorry. I know my apology has no value to you, and I have no right to say it. But Miss Delgado, please hear this one thing from me. I understand the pain of losing someone innocent because of another person's hands. I understand what it feels like when something pure is taken away, and nothing can ever give it back. I understand it far more than you think." Ruth stopped, and her anger wavered before that strange honesty. "What could you possibly understand?" she said, but her voice had weakened. "You lost nothing. You sit there with the calm of a man who never had to pay the price for anything." Bianchi lifted his eyes to her, and there was something in his gaze that made her shiver. "Do you remember the day they sentenced me, Miss Delgado?" he said softly. "You were sitting on the right side, in the second row. You wore a gray coat, and you held yourself so tightly it was as if you were trying to keep from breaking into pieces." Ruth froze. She had never told him she had been there. I turned and looked at you that day," he continued, and his voice trembled. "I knew who you were. I knew what you had lost. And I looked at you with everything I was not allowed to say then. For the past 3 years, I have wondered how you understood that look." Ruth remembered that moment, the gaze she had carved into her heart like a curse, the gaze she had always believed was the cold indifference of an unrepentant killer. But now, sitting across from the man weeping over her daughter's photograph, she suddenly was no longer certain what she had seen in those eyes. "How did you look at me?" she whispered, almost without sound. She did not know whether she wanted to hear the answer. Bianchi slowly shook his head, a single drop spilling over the deep lines of his weathered cheek. "Not now," he said again, that sentence that had become a wall between them. "But I promise you, Miss Delgado, before all of this ends, you will know the truth, the whole truth, and I only pray that when that day comes, you will be strong enough to receive it." Ruth picked up the photograph with trembling hands, pressed it against her chest, and for the first time in 3 years, she cried in front of another person, tears she could not hold back, while the man behind the glass quietly bowed his head, as if he were sharing with her a burden she did not yet fully understand. That night Ruth could not sleep again, but this time it was not because of anger. It was because the strange tears of the man behind the glass kept haunting her, and more than that, because of the honest pain she had seen in him when he said he understood what it felt like for something innocent to be stolen away. Those were not the words of a man putting on an act. She had sat beside enough people in the most truthful hours of their lives to know the difference between falsehood and real pain, and what she had seen in Bianchi was real pain. A few days later, when she returned to the visitation room, she no longer carried the cold shield she had brought with her before, and perhaps Bianchi sensed that change too, because he looked at her longer than usual, as if weighing something heavy. Ruth sat down, and instead of keeping silent, she asked him the question that had troubled her through many nights. "Mr. Bianchi, the other day you said you understood my pain more than I thought. You said it with a sincerity I can't forget. I need you to explain it to me. Who did you lose? What innocence of yours was stolen?" Bianchi lowered his head and looked at his cuffed hands for a long time, and when he raised his eyes again, his face carried the weariness of a man who had borne something too long and too heavy. "Miss Delgado," he began, his voice deep and slow, "I will not lie to you, not even once in the days that remain of my life. I have done many terrible things. My hands are not clean, and I will never pretend they are. There are sins I must answer for, sins that, if justice were truly fair, would also deserve punishment. I lived in a world of violence, and I chose to remain in that world for far too long, and because of that, I carry a burden no prison can fully contain. That much I admit, and I ask no one to pity me for it." He stopped, and his eyes looked straight into hers with an intensity that made it impossible for her to turn away. "But the thing they are sending me to that final room for, the crime they placed on me, the night your husband and daughter died, Miss Delgado, I swear to you, I swear on my mother's soul and on this Bible, that is not something I did. I am not the man who did that to your family. I did not order it, and I was not involved in it the way they said." Ruth felt her breath catch, and a terrible mixture of hope and panic rose inside her chest. "If it wasn't you," she said, her voice trembling, "then who was it? They had evidence, they found the weapon. They had witnesses. An entire trial convicted you. You can't just sit there and tell me all of it was wrong." Bianchi closed his eyes for a moment, as if the name he was about to speak weighed more heavily on him than all the chains on his body, and when he opened them, she saw in them a grief tangled with something almost like betrayal. "Danny," he said softly, nearly only a breath. "His name is Danny." The name hung suspended in the narrow space between them, and Ruth leaned forward. "Who is Danny? Who are you talking about?" But Bianchi shook his head, and she saw him close himself off like a door being shut, not because he wanted to hide, but because something kept him from saying more. "I cannot tell you more, Miss Delgado, not yet, and I beg you to believe that my silence is not because I am protecting myself. If it were only my life, I would have said everything a long time ago. I kept silent because there are things, people, more important than my life, and I promise to protect them, whatever the cost might be." He looked at her, and his voice sank into an urgent whisper. "But I gave you that name not to save myself. I gave it because you deserve to know a piece of the truth, because for 3 years you have carried hatred toward the wrong man, and that is unjust to you. You have suffered enough. At the very least, you should know that the person who truly caused your pain is still out there. Ruth sat motionless, her mind spinning, and one part of her wanted to cry out that he was lying, that this was only the final trick of a desperate man, but she could not, because everything she had witnessed in recent days, his mother's Bible, the meal given to the sick boy, the tears in the night, the honest grief before Sophia's photograph, all of it whispered to her that this man was telling the truth. And if he was telling the truth, then the whole world she had built over the past 3 years, all the hatred that had kept her alive, had been built upon a lie. The name Danny and Bianchi's oath on his mother's soul pushed Ruth towards a decision that only a few weeks earlier she would have called madness, and that was to reopen the case file, not with the eyes of a wife and mother screaming for justice, but with the steady eyes of someone trying to find the truth. That night, she spread every public document she had been able to gather across the dining table, between the 2 empty chairs she had never put away, and she began reading line by line, something she had not had the courage to do in 3 years, because every word in those pages felt like a blade. She read the witness statements, read the police reports, read the trial transcript, and forced herself to look at details she had once only skimmed through in blind pain. And then she saw it. Something so small perhaps no one had cared to notice, but once seen, it could not be ignored. According to the testimony of the main witness, the person who had insisted he saw Bianchi give the order for the shooting, the incident happened at 9:15 at night, on the corner where the grocery store stood. But in another set of documents, a movement log created during the investigation recorded that Bianchi's car had been captured by a security camera in the Harbor District, nearly 40 minutes by car from the scene, at 10 minutes to 9. Ruth sat upright, her heart beating faster. If he had been at the harbor at 10 minutes to 9, how could he have been present to give the order for something that happened on the other side of the city, only 25 minutes later? The timing did not fit. It could not fit unless something had been missed, or worse, deliberately hidden. She turned the pages again and again, searching for an explanation, some detail that might fill that gap, but there was nothing. Throughout the trial, this inconsistency had never been raised, never been used by Bianchi's attorney, as if he himself had chosen not to let it come into the light. Ruth sat in the pale yellow glow of the kitchen, surrounded by scattered case papers, and she felt the ground beneath her feet beginning to split open. The entire structure she had leaned on to keep herself standing for 3 years, the firm belief that Bianchi was the man who had destroyed her, was shaking violently, and the fear she felt was even greater than the anger she had once carried, because if she had been wrong, if she had poured all her hatred onto the wrong man, then who was she, and what had her 3 years of suffering meant? The next morning, unable to bear the weight of what she had discovered, Ruth went to find Sister Agnes in the small chapel of the convent, where the old woman often sat praying in the early hours. She told her everything, about the name Danny, about Bianchi's oath, about the mismatch in the timeline, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "I'm afraid, sister," she confessed. "I'm afraid of what I'm finding. For 3 years, that hatred was the only thing keeping me alive. It gave me a reason to wake up each morning, someone to blame, a target into which I could pour all my pain. If I now discover that I was wrong, that the man I hated is not the guilty one, then I don't know what will be left of me. I would rather keep believing he is guilty, so everything can remain simple, so I don't have to face this." Sister Agnes listened in silence, her wrinkled hands holding Ruth's, and when Ruth had finished, the old woman looked at her with eyes filled with the understanding of an entire lifetime. "Ruth, my child," she said softly, "truth does not care whether we love it or not. It does not require us to find it pleasant. It does not require us to want it. It asks only one thing of us, that we dare to look it in the face. You can close your eyes. You can choose to keep believing the easier thing, and I understand why you would want to, because this time the truth may cost you more dearly than the lie. But ask your own heart, my child, can hatred built on something unreal ever heal you? Or will it only keep you imprisoned forever? You came to this calling to look evil in the face. So now when truth is inviting you to look straight at it, will you turn away?" Ruth lowered her head, tears falling onto the hands clasping the old woman's, and she knew the answer even while she feared it. She could not turn away. Whatever the cost, even if it tore her into pieces, she had to know the truth, not only for Bianchi but for Miguel and Sophia. Because if the real person who caused their deaths was still out there, Then she owed them that much. She owed them the act of finding him. That resolve led Ruth to a threshold she knew she could not cross, and then return from unchanged, because she was only a chaplain, not a lawyer, not an investigator, and what she was preparing to do lay entirely beyond the bounds of her duty. But the mismatch in the timeline kept haunting her like a bell that would not stop ringing, and she knew that if she brought what she had found to the right person, someone with both authority and a conscience willing to listen, then perhaps the truth might still have a chance to come into the light. After many days of asking quietly, the name that kept returning was Miriam Sokolov, an assistant district attorney known for being sharp, hard, and uncompromising, but also someone lawyers quietly respected for a rare integrity in a system everyone knew was full of bargains and compromises. Ruth had to call 3 times and wait more than a week before she was granted a brief appointment. And when she stepped into Sokolov's cramped office, crowded with stacks of case files, she felt her heart pounding, because she knew she was about to say something that might make her seem naive, or even insane. Sokolov was a woman of about 45, her black hair cut short and neat, her cold, sharp eyes looking straight at the person before her, as if weighing every word they spoke. She did not have much time, and she made that clear from the beginning, but Ruth had prepared carefully, and she presented everything as clearly as she could. Miss Sokolov, I know I am only a prison chaplain, and I know what I am about to say may sound unbelievable coming from someone like me, someone who lost her husband and daughter in this very case. But I ask you to give me a few minutes, because I did not come here asking for pity. I came because I believe a terrible mistake has been made. She placed the documents she had copied on the desk, pointed out the mismatch between the witness testimony and the harbor camera footage, and spoke in a trembling but determined voice. If his car was at the harbor at 10 minutes to 9, there is no way he could have been on the other side of the city to give the order for the incident at 9:15. That distance takes nearly 40 minutes. This detail was never raised at trial. I don't understand why, but I know it doesn't fit. Sokolov picked up the documents, and for the first time, the impatience on her face changed, her sharp eyes moving across each line with the focus of a hunter who had just caught a scent. She was silent for a long while, then looked up at Ruth with a gaze entirely different from the one she had worn at first. Miss Delgado, why are you doing this? This man was convicted of killing your family. If he is cleared, you gain nothing, and you will have to live with the truth that the killer is still out there. Most people in your position would want to see him die, whether right or wrong. So what brings you here? Trying to save the very man the whole world says destroyed your life. Ruth looked straight into her eyes, and her answer came from a deep place she had only just discovered within herself. Because if he is not the one who did it, Miss Sokolov, then it means that for the past 3 years the person who truly took Miguel and Sophia from me has been free. He has lived, breathed, slept peacefully each night, while an innocent man waited to die in his place. I am not doing this to save Mr. Bianchi. I am doing this because I owe my husband and my daughter real justice, not false justice built on a mistake. They deserve the truth, and I will not let them rest on a lie, even if that means I must give up the very hatred that has kept me alive for so long. Sokolov leaned back in her chair, studying the young woman before her with a new respect, and after a long silence she slowly nodded. You know, Miss Delgado, in 20 years of doing this work, I have learned that the most frightening cases are not the ones in which we wrongly try the guilty, but the ones in which we move too quickly, become too certain, until no one bothers to ask questions. This mismatch in the timeline bothers me. It should have bothered a great many people 3 years ago. I'm not promising anything, you understand, but I will look into it. I will dig quietly, and if something was buried here, I will find it. Ruth left that office with a feeling both relieved and heavy, because she knew she had just lit the fuse of something that could no longer be stopped, a process that would overturn everything, and all she could do was pray that time, the thing running out day by day for Bianchi, would be enough for the truth to surface. While Sokolov began quietly digging, Ruth continued her visits, and now they carried an entirely different shade, because the wall between her and the man behind the glass had almost completely collapsed, and in its place, a fragile but real trust was beginning to grow. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the high window and laid pale streaks across the metal table, Ruth gathered all her courage and asked him the thing she had longed to know, ever since the name Danny had been spoken. Mr. Bianchi, you said you stayed silent to protect someone, that there are people more important than your own life. I need to understand. If you want me to believe you, if you want me to help you, then I need you to tell me the truth. Who is Danny to you, and why are you willing to die to protect something connected to him? Bianchi was silent for a very long time, and Ruth saw in those gray eyes a door slowly opening, a door leading into a past he had perhaps never told anyone. To understand this, Miss Delgado, he began, his voice rough with emotion, you have to go back more than 20 years, to when I was a 15-year-old boy wandering the streets around the harbor, with no father, no mother, no money in my pocket, a child the whole world had thrown away. I did the things a starving child has to do in order to survive, and one winter night, I made enemies of men no one should ever make enemies of. They cornered me in a dark alley, and I thought that would be the last night of my life. I was only 15, Miss Delgado, and I lay there on the cold snow, waiting for death to come for me. He stopped, his throat tightening, and his cuffed hands clenched together. But a man happened to pass that alley. His name was Thomas Falk. He was a harbor worker, an honest man, poor, with nothing but a heart, far too kind for the harsh world we lived in. He could have kept walking, could have turned his face away as everyone else always did from a street kid like me. But he didn't. He rushed in, shielded me, and faced those men to save a child he did not even know. Bianchi's voice broke, and for the first time, Ruth saw this powerful man completely unable to contain his pain. Thomas saved me, Miss Delgado. He got me out of that alley, but the price he paid for his kindness was too high. The wounds he took that night in my place, because of me, took his life not long after. An honest father died, leaving behind a wife and little children, only because he had stopped to save a nameless boy he never needed to care about. I lived, Miss Delgado. I lived because he died. Do you understand how heavy a debt like that is? A debt paid in blood, paid with an entire life. Ruth sat motionless, tears streaming down her cheeks, and she began to understand the shape of the burden this man had carried for so many years. At his bedside, in his final hours, Bianchi continued, his voice now only a whisper. Thomas took my hand. He did not blame me, not once. He spoke no resentment. He asked only one thing of me. He said, Salvatore, I do not regret giving my life to save you, but I worry for my children. Promise me you will watch over them, that you will not let them grow up abandoned as you once did. And I promised. I knelt beside his bed and swore on everything most sacred that I would protect his children until the last breath of my life. Danny is Thomas's eldest son, and the youngest boy, the last child Thomas never lived to see grow up, is named Leo. He lifted his eyes to Ruth, and in that tear-filled gaze was an ocean of pain and resolve. Now do you understand, Miss Delgado? The oath I kept was not to Danny. It was to the father who died because of me, and no matter what Danny has done, no matter what price I have to pay, there is one thing I will never break, and that is the promise I gave to a dying man. The man who gave me the very life I have been living. Ruth raised her hand to cover her mouth, trying to hold back a sob, because she realized that the man before her was not a monster, but a soul being torn apart by his own loyalty and honor, a man willing to walk toward the execution chamber in order to keep whole a promise he had given with all his heart. The story of Thomas Falk and the promise made at his deathbed had revealed one piece of the picture, but there was still a darkness Ruth could not understand, and she gently urged him to go further, because she knew time was running out and she needed the whole truth. But if you promise to protect Thomas's children, she said softly, then why is Danny the one who drove you to this point? You said his name as if he were the source of everything. I don't understand, Mr. Bianchi. Please explain it to me. Bianchi sighed, a sigh carrying the weight of so many years of silence, and he looked down at his hands before speaking. Danny grew up in the shadow of a father everyone praised as decent, and perhaps that was what wore him down in a way I failed to see in time. I tried to raise him, gave him a place, taught him the rules I believed in, the lines that must never be crossed. But inside Danny there was a hunger, a cold ambition I was too blind to acknowledge, because I always looked at him through the face of the father who had saved my life. Danny wanted more than what he had. He wanted everything I held, and he no longer had the patience to wait. He stopped, and his voice grew heavier. The night your family died, Miss Delgado, Danny was the one who caused it all. It was a settlement he staged to remove the people standing in his way, and those fatal bullets strayed into innocent people who had nothing to do with any of it. But Danny had planned even farther than that. He understood that as long as I was still there, he would never have what he wanted. So he arranged everything, placed every piece of evidence so it pointed toward me, bought the mouths that needed to be bought, so his own crime would be placed on my shoulders. And he succeeded. He removed me, and he took everything. Ruth felt a new fury rising inside her, no longer aimed at the man before her, but at the one named Danny who had built this tragedy. But you have evidence, don't you? You must know something that could expose him. Why didn't you say it? Why did you let yourself be convicted for something you didn't do, just to protect the very man who betrayed you? Bianchi lifted his eyes, and in them was the anguish of a man trapped between two things that could not be reconciled. Because Danny knew my only weak place, Miss Delgado. He knew about the promise I gave his father, and he used that very promise to bind me. He told me that if I opened my mouth, if I spoke even one word of the truth, then Leo, his younger brother, the young man I had sworn to his dying father I would protect, would have no one left in this world standing between him and all the dangers of the world we lived in. He told me Leo would lose his only home, lose the last shield protecting him, and would be left alone to face shadows a young man should never have to face. Danny knew I would rather die than let that happen. He placed his own brother's life on the scale, and he knew I would always choose to protect him, even if the price was my life. Ruth sat frozen, horrified by the cruelty of a plan that had turned Bianchi's own kindness and honor into the noose around his neck. "So you chose silence," she whispered. "You chose to walk to the scaffold so a child could be safe." Bianchi slowly nodded. "I gave a promise, Miss Delgado, and I would rather keep it whole with my entire life than break it to save this body of mine. Leo is the last clean thing I can protect in my filthy world. If my death can give the boy a future, then it is the most worthy death a man like me could hope for." He stopped, then added another sentence in a thoughtful voice that caught Ruth's attention. "Though to be honest, Miss Delgado, sometimes I wonder whether Danny truly came up with this entire intricate scheme on his own. There are details, arrangements, things far beyond him. It is as if another hand, wiser and more dangerous, has been quietly pulling the strings from the darkness." He shook his head, pushing the thought away, but it had already planted a new unease in Ruth's heart, and she left the visitation room that day with the feeling that this tragedy was deeper and darker than anything she had imagined. In the days that followed, Miriam Sokolov began quietly pulling at each thread of the web of lies that had covered the case for 3 years, and she did so with the caution of someone who knew exactly what she was touching. She had the harbor security footage verified again, traced the flow of money that had quietly changed hands around the time of the trial, and began questioning old witnesses, the people whose testimony had nailed Bianchi to his death sentence. But the world Danny ruled had ears everywhere, and it was no surprise that Sokolov's moves, no matter how discreet, soon disturbed the surface of water that had seemed still. Ruth had no idea that her very appearance, the questions she asked and the doors she knocked on, had become a ripple spreading to places she could not have imagined. One evening, when she returned to her apartment after a long shift, she sensed something was wrong the moment she reached her door. A white envelope, with no stamp and no return address, had been slipped neatly beneath it. Her heart beat faster as she picked it up, because no one delivered a letter that way unless they did not want to leave a trail. She opened the envelope with slightly trembling hands, and inside there was only a single sheet of paper, printed with a few cold, brief lines. The words said that some old wounds were best left asleep, that a woman who had already lost too much should not recklessly risk losing the little piece she had left, and that there were roads which, once entered, offered no way back. There was no direct threat, not a single word that could be called unlawful, but the message hidden beneath those carefully chosen sentences was terrifyingly clear. Someone knew what she was doing. Someone wanted her to stop. Ruth stood motionless in the dark hallway, the paper trembling in her hand, and for the first time since beginning this journey, she felt a very real fear. Not the fear of facing the truth inside herself, but the fear of a flesh and blood danger waiting somewhere out there. That night she barely slept, sitting curled up in the chair between the two familiar empty chairs, the paper lying on the table before her like a coiled snake. A part of her, the part already exhausted by loss and grief, whispered that perhaps she should stop, that she had lost everything already and had nothing left to trade away, that her own safety was worth protecting too. She had lost Miguel, had lost Sophia, And now someone was warning her that she might lose herself as well if she kept going. The next morning, still unable to free herself from the confusion, she brought the paper to Sokolov, and the prosecutor read it with a face that grew more serious with every line. "Miss Delgado," she said, setting the paper down on the desk, "I'm going to be honest with you, because you deserve to know where you stand. This note is not some random person's joke. It tells me two things. First, we are moving in the right direction, so right that someone is beginning to worry. And second, whoever is behind all this is not the kind of person who will sit still and watch the truth come out. I can arrange some measure of protection for you, but I cannot promise you the road ahead will be safe. You have every right to stop now. No one will blame you. You have already done more than anyone could ask of you." Ruth sat in silence for a long while, looking at the white paper with those cold lines, and she thought of Bianchi sitting in his cell, choosing death in order to keep a promise whole. She thought of Miguel and Sofia, of the real justice she owed them. She thought of a child named Leo whom she had never met, being protected by the sacrifice of a man about to leave this world. And when she raised her eyes to Sokolov, her voice had regained its steadiness. "Miss Sokolov, I have lived for 3 years inside my own fear, inside the darkness of loss, and I thought there was nothing left in this world that could frighten me any more than that. Whoever thinks he can scare me into stopping with a piece of paper does not understand that I have nothing left to lose in the way he imagines. If I step back now, if I let fear win, then an innocent man will die, a child will lose the person protecting him, and the man who took my family from me will be free forever. I cannot live with that. I will continue. I will follow this road to the very end, wherever it leads me." Sokolov looked at her for a long time, then gave a slight nod with eyes filled with both worry and respect, and she knew that the young woman sitting before her, fragile and wounded though she was, carried a courage no threat could break. Ruth's courage seemed to give Sokolov renewed strength, and the prosecutor moved her investigation forward with new urgency, because both women were keenly aware that the clock was ticking down day by day toward the fateful morning when Bianchi would be taken to the final room. Sokolov focused all her effort on the weakest link in the chain of evidence, the testimony of the main witness, the person who had sworn under oath that he had seen Bianchi give the order for the shooting, testimony that had become the foundation stone of the entire sentence. She followed the records, matched the timelines, and began to realize that the testimony contained cracks that would break wide open if only someone dug a little deeper. But what stunned Sokolov, and what she was forced to tell Ruth with unusual caution, was the identity of that witness. That afternoon, she called Ruth to her office, and when Ruth stepped inside, she immediately sensed that something had changed in the prosecutor's eyes, a hesitation she had never seen before in this sharp woman. "Miss Delgado," Sokolov began slowly, "I have found the main witness, the man whose testimony convicted Bianchi, and I need you to prepare yourself, because this will not be easy for you." She pushed a file across the desk, already open to the page with a portrait photograph, and when Ruth looked down at the face in the picture, the whole world around her seemed to stop turning. It was a face she knew very well, a face she had seen dozens of times at church services, a man named Gerald Whitfield, whom she had always believed to be gentle and devout, a member of the parish community whom she herself had once sat beside and comforted 4 years ago when his wife passed away, leaving him alone to raise his young grandson. She had held his hand, had prayed with him, had believed he was one of the kindest people she had ever met. "That's impossible," Ruth whispered, her voice hoarse. "Mr. Whitfield? No, there must be some mistake. I know him. He is a good man, a man of the church. He could never be someone who lied under oath so an innocent man would die." Sokolov looked at her with deep sympathy, but she did not waver. "I understand how difficult this is to accept, Miss Delgado, but I have checked it carefully. At the time he claimed to have seen Bianchi at the scene, there is evidence showing he was not even near that place. His testimony was fabricated from beginning to end, and I traced a significant sum of money deposited into his family's account not long after the trial. This is not a mistake. He was paid or forced to lie." Ruth sank heavily into the chair, stunned, because this blow was more terrible than anything she had yet endured. The evil she had always imagined as something foreign, wearing the faces of brutal men from the underworld, had now appeared beneath the familiar and gentle face of a man she had trusted, comforted, and knelt beside in prayer. She realized that evil did not always scream and show itself openly. Sometimes it was simply the silence of a decent person who chose fear instead of truth. Why, she asked, almost to herself. Why would someone like him do that? Sokolov sighed. Fear, Miss Delgado. It is almost always fear. Men like Danny do not need to be monsters to force an honest person to betray his conscience. They only need to find the thing that person loves most and threaten it. I suspect Mr. Whitfield was placed in a position where he believed he had no choice. That does not excuse what he did. An innocent man has been waiting to die because of his cowardice, but it does explain it. And now, if I can persuade him to tell the truth, to admit that his testimony was false, that may be the piece we need to overturn the entire sentence. But just as that spark of hope appeared, Sokolov extinguished it with a cold truth. The problem is time, Miss Delgado. The execution order has been set. We no longer have many days. The execution is scheduled for dawn tomorrow. We have less than 12 hours. For a confession to have legal value, for it to reach the people with the power to order a stay in time, I need to persuade Mr. Whitfield immediately, and I need him to be brave enough to face the very fear that has kept him silent for 3 years. If he hesitates, if he backs away, then everything we have found will become meaningless, and an innocent man will die in just a matter of hours before the truth has the chance to save him. Ruth felt her whole chest tighten, because now the battle was no longer only against lies, but a breathless race against time itself, and every ticking second was drawing Bianchi closer to a death he did not deserve. While Sokolov rushed away to persuade Whitfield in the breathless race against time, Ruth felt she could not simply sit still and wait, and she went to the visitation room once more, perhaps for one of the last times, because now her heart had completely changed. She no longer entered with hatred or doubt, but with an ache of remorse and one great question she needed to hear him answer himself. Bianchi was sitting there as always, and when he lifted his eyes to look at her, he seemed to read at once that something inside her had crossed over to a new shore. You know, he said softly, not as a question. Ruth nodded, sat down, and her eyes filled with tears. I know, Mr. Bianchi, I know you didn't do it. I know about Danny, about what he arranged, about the witness who lied. And I know you chose silence to protect Leo. But there is one thing I still can't understand. One thing that keeps tormenting me, and I need you to tell me the truth. Why me? From the beginning, you specifically requested me as your chaplain. Why would you choose the woman who hated you more than anyone else in this world to be beside you in your final days? You didn't need someone like me. You could have chosen anyone for comfort. So why me? Bianchi was silent for a long time, and Ruth saw a struggle in his eyes, as if he were standing before a door that once opened could never be closed again. Miss Delgado, he finally said, his voice rough and slow. I chose you not because I was seeking comfort. I do not deserve comfort, and I never expected it. I also did not choose you so you could listen to me defend myself, so I could try to persuade you that I was innocent and hope for your pity. If it had only been for my own life, I would not have needed you, and I would have found a way to save myself long ago. He stopped, and his voice lowered into something almost painful. I chose you because you carry within you the pain I could not prevent. You are the living face of the worst thing that happened while I was still able to see it, the pain I should have been able to stop but did not. For the past 3 years, Miss Delgado, you and everything you lost have not left my mind for even one day. You are the burden I carry into every sleepless night, the face I see whenever I close my eyes. And when I knew my day was drawing near, I realized there was one thing I needed to do before I left this world. One thing I could only do with you, and with no one else. Ruth leaned forward, her heart pounding. What? What do you need to do with me? But Bianchi shook his head gently, and she saw that familiar restraint close around him again. Not now, Miss Delgado. But this time, I promise, it will not be long. There is something I need to give you, and I need you to understand the truth first. Need you to believe with all your heart that I am not the man who did it, because otherwise what I give you would only be an insult, another blade cutting into your wound. I cannot let that happen. You have already endured too much. Lifted his eyes to her, and in those gray eyes was a deep urgency. But there is one thing I can say to you now, and I beg you to remember it. I am not asking you to forgive me, Miss Delgado. I have no right to demand that, and I do not need it for myself. The only thing I long for, the thing I pray for every night in my cell, is that you do not let hatred consume you any longer. For 3 years, you have let anger and grief gnaw at your heart, and I understand that. I understand it more than anyone. But you still have a life ahead of you, and Miguel and Sophia would not want to see you imprison yourself in darkness because of them. Whatever happens to me, whether the truth comes in time to save me or not, please promise me one thing, that you will find the light again, that you will allow your heart to be healed. Tears rolled down Ruth's cheeks, and she realized that this man facing death, instead of worrying for himself, was worrying about the peace of her soul, and that left her so moved and so wounded that she could not speak. The final night settled over Stateville Prison like a heavy curtain, and while Sokolov was still somewhere out there racing against time to persuade Whitfield to speak, inside these cold walls, Salvatore Bianchi was living the final hours of his life, with a calm that left the correctional officers stunned. As custom required, they asked him about his final meal, that small ritual the prison offered to those about to leave this world, but he only shook his head softly and refused. "Thank you," he told the officer, "but tonight I want to keep my heart clean. An empty stomach sometimes makes the soul feel lighter." They asked whether he wanted to make one final call to anyone, a relative, a lawyer, someone outside these walls, and again he shook his head, because the farewells that needed to be spoken had already been sent in his own way long ago, and there was no one out there whose voice he wished to hear in this hour. The only thing he asked for, and he asked it in a voice so quiet it was almost hesitant, was a small image of Our Lady of Sorrows, the image of the mother whose heart is pierced by swords, the symbol of a mother's pain as she witnesses her child suffer. The correctional officers, who were used to requests far stranger than that, brought him a small picture from the chapel, and he accepted it with both cuffed hands, gazing at the sorrowful yet peaceful face of the Holy Mother with deep reverence. "I'm about to meet you," he whispered to the image, so softly that no one could clearly hear. That night, Ruth asked to see him one last time in her role as his chaplain, and when the visitation room door opened, she saw him sitting there, with the image of the Holy Mother placed before him and his mother's Bible beside it, a picture of aching peace in the middle of this dark place. "You came again," he said, and a faint smile passed over his tired face. "I'm glad I get to see you one more time, Miss Delgado." Ruth sat down, her throat tight, because she knew Sokolov still had no certain news, and time was running out minute by minute. "Miss Sokolov is still trying," she said, her voice trembling. "There is still hope, Mr. Bianchi. Please don't give up hope." He looked at her with the gentle eyes of a man who had placed himself beyond both hope and despair. "I have made peace with whatever is coming, Miss Delgado. If the truth arrives in time, I will receive it with gratitude. If it does not, then I have still kept whole the most important thing, and I will leave in peace. But there is one thing I need to do tonight, and I have waited for this moment for a very long time." He lifted his cuffed hands, gesturing toward an official property document on the table. "Miss Delgado," he said, his voice shaking with an emotion she did not fully understand, "I have requested the warden's special permission to transfer a sealed box of my final personal effects to you. It contains the only remnants of my past, an item I brought with me and locked away in my private estate papers before the handcuffs ever closed on me. My attorney was given strict instructions to deliver this sealed box to the prison storage only when my final hour was set, completely unaware of its specific contents. I signed the release papers this morning so that Officer Wade can hand it directly to you tomorrow morning, right before I take my final steps into that room." Ruth listened in silence, unable to see what was inside the sealed box, but the sheer weight of his words and the finality of his gesture pressed heavily against her heart. "I cannot accept a parting gift from you, Mr. Bianchi," she whispered, her voice trembling as tears rose in her eyes. "You should keep your peace with whatever you hold dear." Bianchi smiled, a sorrowful but warm smile. "It is precisely because it is precious that I want to give it to you, Miss Delgado. Some gifts become whole in meaning only when they are placed in the right hands. I want you to have it, and one day, when you look at it, perhaps you will understand more than I am able to say tonight." Ruth placed her hand on the glass opposite his, staring at the old beads, and she could not stop the tears from rolling down her face, because she knew this might be the last time she would sit across from this strange man, the man she had hated with all her heart, and then slowly come to understand with all her heart, and she prayed in desperation that the coming dawn would not be the end of everything. Dawn on that fateful day came to Stateville Prison in a cold gray color, a pale light falling through the tall, narrow windows and casting a lifeless glow along the corridors, carrying no warmth at all. The entire building seemed to awaken beneath a quiet tension, that thick, heavy atmosphere that existed only on days like this, when the cold machinery of execution procedure began moving with exact and emotionless precision. The correctional officers walked back and forth with solemn faces, avoiding one another's eyes, avoiding even unnecessary words, because each of them carried the weight of what was about to happen. The doctor had been called in. The required witnesses had begun to gather, and every step of that dreadful process was checked and checked again with a meticulousness that chilled the soul. Ruth had been at the prison since before the sky was fully light, after a night with almost no sleep, her heart pounding like a drum in the storm twisting inside her. She had called Sokolov more times than she could count, and each time the answer remained the same breathless waiting. Whitfield was still hesitating. The confession had not yet been signed, and the legal wheel, usually so slow, now seemed to crawl with unbearable cruelty while a human life was slipping away second by second. She stood in the corridor, helpless, feeling as if she were witnessing something terrible and could not stop it, and her heart, the heart that only a few weeks ago had still been filled with hatred for this man, was now breaking from fear for him. The final morning arrived with a cold, heavy silence. As Salvatore Bianchi was led down the corridor, the air turned to ice as he paused before the chapel door, fulfilling the unprecedented request he had made just hours earlier to see the Blessed Mother. The initial shock that had paralyzed the guards and the warden when the request was first approved now gave way to a grim, hushed urgency. Warden Doyle, remembering the strict 5-minute limit he had reluctantly granted, gave a brief, tense nod to the escort team. He looked at Ruth, his expression softening slightly. "Take him in, Miss Delgado. Your time starts now." Ruth nodded, her heart pounding, and she stepped to Bianchi's side as the correctional officers loosened part of his restraint so he would be able to kneel. She felt the eyes of everyone fixed on the two of them, felt the weight of this moment pressing down on her shoulders. As they walked toward the door of the small chapel, Bianchi inclined his head slightly toward her and spoke in a voice meant for her alone. "Thank you, Miss Delgado, for everything you have done. Whatever the ending may be, you have given me something I did not dare hope for in these final days, the chance to stand before a soul that has found its own compassion again." Just then, Officer Wade stepped forward and silently slipped a small, velvet-lined wooden box into Ruth's hands, whispering that Bianchi had insisted she hold it now. Ruth could not answer, her throat sealed tight, and she clutched the unopened box tightly against her chest as the chapel door slowly opened before them, revealing the quiet little room with the statue of the Holy Mother standing in the dim candlelight. She had no idea that in the next 5 brief minutes, within those 4 sacred walls, one final truth and a miracle she could never have foreseen would change her life forever. The chapel door closed behind them with a deep, dull sound, and in that very instant the cold noise of the prison machinery seemed to vanish completely, giving way to an unusual stillness, a stillness so thick and deep that Ruth could hear the beating of her own heart. The small room was submerged in the dim glow of the candles placed at the feet of the statue of the Holy Mother, and the air inside carried a strange weight, that tense, heavy fullness people feel in the moments before a storm breaks, when the whole sky seems to hold its breath and wait. Ruth stood motionless beside the door, the 2 escorting officers standing rigidly in opposite corners of the room, and all of them remained silent as if something sacred had spread over the space. Bianchi walked toward the statue with slow steps, the chains at his ankles lightly striking the stone floor and sending small echoes through the stillness, and then he slowly knelt before the Holy Mother. His cuffed hands resting one over the other, his silver-touched head bowed low in a posture of absolute humility. It was then that Ruth felt the first in a chain of things she would never be able to fully explain for the rest of her life. A faint fragrance spread through the room, the scent of lilies, the sweet and pure scent of spring, gentle yet unmistakable, slipping into each breath she took. But this was the middle of winter, and in this cold chapel there was not a single flower, nothing that could have given off that fragrance. Ruth blinked, wondering whether her exhausted mind was deceiving her, but the scent was still there, real and clear, growing stronger by the moment. Then she noticed the main candle on the altar, the tall candle placed directly below the statue's feet. Its flame, which had been flickering weakly like the others, suddenly rose in a strange way, upright and steady, burning far brighter, though no wind had passed through the sealed room. Its warm golden light spread outward, surrounding the peaceful face of the Holy Mother, and the figure of the man kneeling at the statue's feet, creating a scene whose solemn and mysterious beauty made Ruth feel breathless. One of the two officers shifted slightly, as if he too sensed that something unusual was taking place, but no one dared speak, no one dared break the sacred atmosphere covering them all. And in that stillness, Bianchi began to speak, his voice low and soft, but in that room of absolute quiet, every word he uttered sounded clear, as if carved into the air. "Mother," he said, his head still bowed, "I come before you tonight not to beg for my life to be spared. I know who I am, and I know what I have done. I have lived an entire life in darkness. I allowed violence to become my language. I chose a road I knew was wrong, when I was still too young to understand its full cost. I have caused suffering to so many people. I have allowed my heart to harden before things that should have moved me to pity. I do not ask you to wash those stains away, because they are mine, and I will carry them with me wherever I must go." He stopped, and Ruth saw his shoulders tremble faintly, as though the burden of an entire life was being poured out, little by little, in this sacred room. "I ask you for only one thing," he continued, his voice breaking with emotion. "Please listen to the honest confession of a sinner in the final hour of his life. I tried in my broken and imperfect way to hold on to a few clean things amid all that filth. I tried to protect the weak when I could. I tried to keep a promise whole even when it demanded the highest price from me. But I know those small things cannot redeem what I have done. I come before you with empty hands and a shattered heart, hoping only to receive the mercy I do not deserve." Ruth stood there with her back against the door, and she felt tears rolling down her cheeks without knowing when they had begun, because she was witnessing something beyond anything she had ever known, a human being standing completely bare before what was sacred to him, a soul being washed in the very tears of its repentance, and she felt vaguely yet undeniably that this tiny room, in this moment, was no longer an ordinary place, but had become a threshold leading to something greater than anything she could understand. It was in that sacred moment, while Ruth stood stunned by Bianchi's confession, that her trembling hand slowly broke the official plastic seal of the property box Officer Wade had just handed her. Inside, resting in the dark for 3 long years away from human eyes, was the old rosary. As she lifted it into the unusually bright glow of the candle flame, her breath caught. On the back of the cross was an engraving, a tiny and delicate image of a little duck, and beneath it were 3 letters carved in the uneven strokes of an untrained hand. Ruth felt the whole world around her tilt, because she knew that engraving. She knew it better than anything else in this life. It was Sophia's rosary, the small rosary on which Miguel himself had carved the little duck their daughter loved, along with the initials of her name, the gift he had made for their daughter on the day of her baptism, the rosary Sophia always carried with her, the rosary that had vanished without a trace on that fateful night, and that Ruth had searched for in desperation for years without ever finding. Her hands began to tremble violently, and a terrifying question exploded in her mind like a bolt of lightning, tearing through the mist of that sacred moment. How had he gotten her daughter's rosary? A rosary that had been lost at the very place, and on the very night her little girl had died, was now in this man's hands. What did that mean? Had he been there? Had he been present on that terrible night? But he had just sworn that he had not done it. She realized now why the police had never found it during his arrest. He had deliberately hidden it away from the law, protecting it from becoming a mere piece of court evidence, just so it could reach her this very way. 1,000 broken pieces of truth spun wildly in her mind, refusing to fit together, and she stood there frozen, her daughter's rosary burning hot in her hand like a whisper from another world she could not yet decipher. She opened her mouth to ask, but at that very moment, Bianchi's voice rose again in the room, and the words he spoke caught her breath, making her forget the question burning on her lips. "Mother," he prayed, and his voice now carried a strange peace. "There is one last thing I wish to offer you. I ask you to forgive Danny. I know he has done terrible things. I know he betrayed me and caused so much suffering. But he too is a lost soul, a child who grew up in darkness and lost himself. Please do not let hatred have a place in my heart at this hour. I forgive him, truly, and I beg you to do the same." Ruth listened to those words and could not believe her ears, because the man kneeling there, Instead of using the last breaths of his life to protest his innocence, to curse the one who had driven him toward death, was asking forgiveness for that very person. "And I ask you for one more thing," he continued. "Please protect Leo. Please never let him carry the burden of his brother's sins on his shoulders. Please let him step into the light. Let him build a clean life that neither Danny nor I was ever able to have. If my death can buy that kind of future for him, then, Mother, I leave with no regret." In that moment, every last doubt inside Ruth disappeared completely, because no guilty man, no false man, could pray such words in the final hour of his life, and she suddenly understood that look. The look Bianchi had given her 3 years earlier in the courtroom. The look she had mistaken all those years for the coldness of a killer. Now, she understood that it had been the look of a man who knew he was innocent, yet had chosen silence. The look of a man bearing a terrible injustice he could not speak aloud. The look of a soul apologizing to her for something he had not caused, but had also failed to prevent. And then, amid the rich scent of lilies and the brilliant golden candlelight, Ruth felt something she would never find words to describe, a warm presence wrapping around her, gentle as an embrace, and deep within her soul, she heard, or perhaps felt, something soft as Sophia's laughter, like her daughter's little voice whispering to her that it was time to let go now, Mommy, time to stop carrying this burden. Tears streamed down Ruth's face, and behind her, one of the 2 correctional officers, Officer Wade himself, the hardened man with 20 years of service, slowly sank down, kneeling on the stone floor of the chapel, his face soaked with tears before something sacred that his reason could not explain. In that moment, amid the candlelight and the fragrance no one could explain, something broke open inside Ruth's chest. But it was not the breaking of pain. It was the breaking of something that had imprisoned her for far too long. For 3 long years she had kept her heart encased in a fortress of bitter resentment, layer upon layer formed from hatred, anger, and the hunger for revenge, and she had believed that wall was what kept her from collapsing, the armor that protected her from grief. She had held that hatred like a flame, believing that as long as it burned, she still had a reason to keep living, believing that letting it go would mean betraying the memory of Miguel and Sofia. But now, as she knelt in her soul before the warm presence she could feel, as she heard deep within herself something as gentle as her daughter's whisper telling her to let go, Ruth suddenly understood a truth she had avoided all this time, that the wall had never protected her at all. It had only imprisoned her. The hatred she had mistaken for strength was truly a chain, and it had not kept Miguel and Sofia alive in her heart as she had believed, but instead had hidden them from her, replacing the sweet memories of her daughter's laughter and her husband's song with the wrong words with a dark and bitter rage. She had allowed someone whose face she still did not even know, not only to steal her family from her, but also to steal 3 years of her life, her soul, and her ability to remember the people she loved with love instead of pain. And in this moment, inside the small sacred chapel, she finally understood that the forgiveness she had always thought was meant for the guilty was in fact a gift she gave to herself, the only key capable of opening the chains that had bound her for so many years. Her tears poured out, but this time they were different from every tear she had cried during the past 3 years. They were not tears of bitterness, not tears of anger or despair, but tears of release, the first tears since that fateful night that carried not darkness but light. She felt as if a giant stone she had carried on her shoulders all those years, the stone Sister Agnes had once spoken of, had finally been set down, and her shoulders, her soul, her whole being, suddenly became so light that she thought she might rise into the air. She thought of Miguel, and for the first time in so long, she remembered him not with a pain that tore through her, but with a smile, remembered the way he sang the old love song with the wrong words just to make their daughter laugh. She thought of Sofia, and instead of the familiar black emptiness, she saw again the little girl's big shining eyes, her laughter clear as silver bells, her tiny warm hand inside Ruth's own. They returned to her, not as ghosts of loss but as angels of love, and she understood that they had never truly left her, only that hatred had hidden them from her for so long. Ruth lifted her daughter's rosary and pressed it to her chest, and she let everything pour out, all the pain, all the burden, all the dark years, melting away in healing tears. She no longer knew how much time had passed, no longer cared about the prison walls, the sentence, or the clock counting down, because in this moment a true miracle was taking place. not a miracle of light or sound or unexplained phenomena, but the quietest and deepest miracle of all, the resurrection of a heart that had seemed to die from sorrow. Bianchi, still kneeling before the statue, turned his head slightly to look at her, and when he saw the tears on her face, when he recognized the change unfolding inside this woman's soul, a peaceful and fulfilled smile appeared on his face, as if this very moment, rather than his own life or death, was what he had been praying for and waiting for all along. And Ruth, through her tears, suddenly understood that no matter how these brief 5 minutes ended, no matter how the fate of the man kneeling there was decided, she had been given something no sentence, no revenge could ever bring her, the peace she had believed she had lost forever. At the very moment peace had just settled inside Ruth's soul, the chapel door suddenly burst open with a loud sound that shattered the stillness, and Miriam Sokolov rushed in, breathless, her hair disheveled, clutching a stack of papers in her hand as if the life of the whole world depended on them. Behind her was Warden Doyle, with his face drained of color, and several officials Ruth did not recognize, all carrying the urgency of people who had just raced against time itself. "Stop," Sokolov said, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and emotion. "Everything has to stop immediately. I have a stay of execution from the governor's office, effective at once." Ruth covered her mouth with her hand, her whole body trembling, and Bianchi slowly lifted his head from prayer, turning toward the door with a calm that carried no surprise at all, as if somewhere deep within him he had always believed truth would finally find its way. Sokolov stepped forward, and before everyone in the room, she began to explain, each word loosening the web of lies that had covered 3 years. "Last night," she said, after many hours of persuasion, Mr. Gerald Whitfield finally confessed that his testimony at the trial was entirely fabricated. He never saw Bianchi at the scene. He was forced to lie, and he has signed a sworn confession. Together with the mismatch in the timeline and the money we traced, we now have enough to prove that this sentence was built on a false foundation." She stopped to breathe, then continued in a more solemn voice. "And last night, the police also arrested Danny Falk. He is the one who stood behind the shooting that took innocent lives 3 years ago, and he is the one who staged all the evidence to frame Mr. Bianchi, so he could seize what Mr. Bianchi controlled." Ruth felt her knees nearly give way when that name was spoken officially, the name of the man who had truly destroyed her life, and a violent wave of emotion rose inside her chest, a mixture of pain, relief, and a long-delayed justice. But Sokolov had not finished, and her next words opened a darkness even deeper. "However, Miss Delgado, Mr. Bianchi, I need you both to understand something. When we dug deeper into the way this evidence was fabricated, the way mouths were silenced, the way an entire system was manipulated so skillfully that no one asked questions for 3 years, we realized Danny Falk could not possibly have done all of this by himself. He was only the one who acted, the one who held the gun and pulled strings at the lower level. Behind him, there is another hand, wiser, more powerful, someone with enough influence to bend justice itself while remaining hidden in the dark. We still do not know who that is, but we will not stop until we find out. This is only the beginning of exposing the whole truth." Bianchi gave a slight nod, and something passed through his eyes showing he had always suspected the existence of that invisible hand, the force that had made it impossible for even a man as powerful as him to clear his own name. Ruth, amid her shock, suddenly remembered the question still burning in her heart, and she stepped in front of Bianchi, holding up Sophia's rosary in her trembling hand. "Mr. Bianchi," she said, her voice choked, "I need you to tell me, this rosary. It belonged to my daughter, to Sophia. It disappeared that night. How did you get it? Please, I beg you, tell me the truth." The entire room sank into silence, every gaze turning toward the man kneeling there, and Bianchi looked at the rosary in Ruth's hand for a long time, his eyes filling with tears. He drew in a deep breath, as if preparing to release the final and heaviest secret he had carried through those 3 long years, the secret that had bound him in silence more tightly than any chain. "Miss Delgado," he said softly, his voice trembling, "it is time you knew the whole truth about that night. The truth about why I was present in a place where I should never have been, and why I have carried your daughter's rosary with me all these years like an act of repentance I could never put into words." And in the breathless stillness of the chapel, Ruth prepared to receive the thing she had been searching for through 3 years of sorrow. The final truth that would close everything. Bianchi bowed his head for a long while, as if gathering the last broken pieces of his courage, and then he began to tell it, his voice low and choked, each word seeming to be torn from the deepest place in his soul. That night, Miss Delgado, I knew Danny was plotting something terrible. I had heard whispers of a settlement he meant to carry out, and I knew he had gone too far, that he was becoming something I could no longer control. I rushed into the night to find him, to stop him, because I still believed, naively, that I could save the son of the man who had saved my life from the abyss he was plunging into. I reached that place, that fateful street corner, but Miss Delgado, I was too late. I was too late by only one beat, one brief moment that I will never, ever forgive myself for. Tears rolled down his weathered face, and the entire room seemed to stop breathing. When I arrived, it had already happened. I saw the aftermath of what Danny had done, and amid all that terrible chaos, I saw a tiny rosary lying on the ground, a child's rosary, with the duck carved into it by the loving hand of a father. I knelt down and picked it up, and in that moment, something inside me broke forever. I, the man who had sworn to protect the innocent, the man who had taken pride in never allowing a family to be harmed, had arrived too late to save your family. Knowing Danny would frame me and the police would soon raid everything I owned, I rushed back to my estate and placed the rosary inside a secure, wax-sealed vault containing my personal will, hiding it among old family mementos where no investigator would question its origin. I kept that rosary preserved in that untouched vault for 3 years, Miss Delgado. Not as a trophy, but as a silent act of repentance, a burden I forced myself to carry so I would never forget that I had failed, that there was something pure I had not been able to protect. Ruth sank to her knees, both hands clutching the rosary, and her tears fell onto the stone floor of the chapel, because now she understood everything, understood the honest pain in his eyes when he looked at Sophia's photograph, understood why he had said he knew the feeling of something innocent being taken away, understood why he had chosen her by name, the woman who carried the pain he had not been able to prevent. My presence there that night, Bianchi continued, his voice lowering, became the noose Danny placed around my neck. Someone had seen me near the scene, and Danny used that, twisted it, turned the presence of a man who came to stop it into proof of a man who gave the order. He wove a perfect story, and with some powerful hand helping from the darkness, he buried the truth so deep that even I could not dig it back up. And when he threatened Leo, I knew I was completely trapped. I could not prove my innocence without breaking the promise to protect the boy. So I chose silence, and I chose to carry this rosary as if I were carrying the guilt of my own helplessness. Ruth looked up at him through her tears, and there was not a trace of hatred left in her now, only a deep compassion for the man who had borne so much because of his loyalty and honor. "You did not fail," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You came, Mr. Bianchi. In a whole world that turned its back on my family, you were the only one who tried to run toward them and save them. You carried that pain for 3 years when it should never have been yours to carry. The guilty one is Danny, not you. And now, at last, the truth has been brought into the light." Sokolov, who had stood silently witnessing that moment with reddened eyes, stepped forward and placed a hand on Ruth's shoulder. "The truth has been brought into the light, but justice is more complicated than that, and I need both of you to understand this clearly. Mr. Bianchi, you have been fully cleared of the murder charge, the charge that brought you to death row. You will not die. But you know better than anyone that your hands are not clean. The years you ran the organization, the extortion charges and the other unlawful acts, those are still true, and you will have to answer for them before the law." Bianchi nodded, and on his face there was no disappointment, only peaceful acceptance. "I never hoped to be called innocent, Miss Sokolov," he said. "I only hoped not to die for a crime I did not commit, and not to carry into the grave the lie that I had harmed Miss Delgado's family. My true sins, I am willing to pay for them. A prison sentence for what I truly did is justice, and I receive it with gratitude, because at least I will be allowed to live and make amends, instead of dying inside an injustice." And in that small chapel, amid the candlelight that had now returned to normal, and the scent of lilies slowly fading away, 3 people stood there in a sacred stillness, sharing the weight of a truth that was both bitter and freeing. Many months had passed since that fateful morning in the chapel, and the lives of the people connected to this story had changed in ways no one could have foreseen. Young Leo, the young man Salvatore Bianchi had been willing to trade his own life to protect, had now found a true path. With the help of distant relatives of his father, the honest worker Thomas Falk of long ago. Leo was safely relocated far away from the harbor, and for the first time in his life, he came to know the feeling of true peace. He was able to go to college, to walk freely beneath the sunlight, to laugh out loud on afternoons with friends, and to step into the light of a promising future instead of the darkness both his brother and Bianchi had been forced to endure. Whenever people saw the young man living with such honesty and hope, they could see that the quiet sacrifice of one man had blossomed into a clear and beautiful reality. And perhaps that was the most meaningful reward Bianchi could ever receive. Officer Wade, the hardened correctional officer who had fallen to his knees in the chapel that day, was no longer the same man he had once been. After more than 20 years spent among the cold corridors of death row, he requested a transfer to care for the prison's small chapel, the place where he had found a peace his entire career had never given him. Every morning, he lit the candles, cleaned the statue of the Holy Mother, and quietly prayed for lost souls who still had a chance to find their way back to the light. As for Ruth, she had found again the thing she had believed was lost forever. On a fresh spring morning, she visited the graves of Miguel and Sophia, two resting places lying side by side beneath the shade of an old maple tree. And for the first time in many years, her steps were no longer heavy with grief and hatred. She knelt beside the two graves and gently placed Sophia's little rosary on the earth between the two people she loved, the rosary that had finally returned to where it belonged. And she smiled through tears of peace. She told them that the truth had been brought into the light, that justice had found its way home, and that she had finally learned to remember them with love instead of pain. She told them she would go on living a full life the way they would have wanted, and carrying their love like a lamp to guide her path instead of a burden pressing down on her shoulders. As for Salvatore Bianchi, he began serving his prison sentence for the real sins he had committed, but even behind bars, he found a new purpose for the life that remained to him. From inside his cell, he began writing letters, hundreds of letters sent to young men standing on the edge of the same lost road he himself had once walked, boys who had grown up in poverty and despair just as he had long ago. He told them his story, warned them about the true cost of the path of violence, and reminded them that it is never too late to choose another way. The man once known as the King of the Harbor, the man who had once spread fear, was now planting seeds of hope, turning the very darkness of his own past into a guiding light to help young people avoid the mistakes he had made. And this story, the story of a chaplain burdened by grief and a condemned man who had seemed beyond saving, leaves us with lessons that perhaps every one of us needs to remember. It reminds us that no human being, no matter how far they have strayed, is ever completely beyond the reach of redemption, and that human dignity can still shine even in the darkest place. It teaches us that forgiveness, the thing we so often believe is a gift meant for the guilty, is in truth the key that frees our own soul, because hatred imprisons only the one who carries it. And it reminds us never to judge a person too quickly by what we hear, because behind every face, there may be a story we have never known. What happened behind the chapel door that day, the things that helped the most bitter woman find peace again, and made even the hardest people weep, became proof of the power of compassion and truth. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so we can continue listening together to more meaningful and compelling stories every day. We would truly love to know how you felt about this story, so please leave a comment and share the emotions deep inside your heart, because every word you share is deeply precious to us. Thank you for listening to the story until the very last moment, and may you, the person watching this video, always have abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in each day. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next videos.